We have an audience watching online, so welcome to them and welcome to everybody in the room. I'm really pleased to see that we have a number of our faculty members here. We have Jeff Cowan, that's a part of it, Mary Murphy, of course Tom Holohan, so many of our esteemed guests that are part of it, many students and representatives from the public diplomacy community. And welcome on this very consequential day, election day here in the US, and really a very, very important moment. And I'm glad that everyone is able to take some time today from that to, I think, hopefully talk about some very important issues that we'd like to address. This event is almost like a follow-up to an event that I recognize a number of you attended last Tuesday when we had a film screening about democracy and autocracy. And I thought that was extremely vibrant discussion with a 17-year-old filmmaker. And today we are pleased to have a conversation with Professor Nick Cull about his most recent book, Reputational Security, Refocusing Public Diplomacy for a Dangerous World. And before we get into that conversation, I have a very distinct pleasure of introducing the moderator for today's conversation, Mr. Barry Sanders. Barry is a adjunct professor of communications and teaches public diplomacy at a little university across town, where he's also on the faculty of the UCLA Law School. Barry is an author of 2 books, American Avatar, The United States in the Global Imagination, as well as Los Angeles 1984 Olympic Games. The second book is particularly relevant to us because of the role Barry played in both bringing the Olympics to Los Angeles in 2008 as well as in 2028. He is director on the LA 28 Commission, has been part of the LA Sports Council, but he's not only a sports guy because he's very involved with the LA Philharmonic, chairs the LA Public Library Foundation, LA Opera, a host of activities that I could go on and on and on about. But Barry also practiced international corporate law at the global law firm of Latham & Watkins. And perhaps most importantly to many of us in the room, to me personally here at USC, is that he's the chair of the board for the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barry, who is going to give an introduction for today's talk and to our speaker.
And it's an enormous pleasure to be here. Thank you. I'm glad to give you an opportunity to get your minds off the election. That's a gift. I'm glad you're all here. The opportunity to do this is something I accepted with great pleasure, and it's an honor to be able to introduce Nick Cull and his latest book. Introducing Nick Cull here at his home court as USC's favorite Englishman, clearly so, with acknowledging Flanders Fields here at the right time of year.
Sorry.
If you follow public diplomacy, and I think everyone both in this room and perhaps the people online certainly do, you'd know that Nick Cull's name is a global name in the world of public diplomacy. You can't put together any kind of book, summary, collection of the best writings in the field of public diplomacy without having an important contribution from Nick Cull's extensive writings. He has shaped the field, and he's a person of whom USC should be justifiably proud. My classes, as you mentioned, Glenn, at UCLA, always contain assignments of various of the writings of Nick Cull. It's particularly interesting that what makes his work so important is the thought that goes into it, of course, the thought that's conveyed by it, of course, but also a couple of special attributes you rarely see in this sort of academic writing. One is he writes essays. His writing is beautiful. It's absolutely readable. It's this kind of stuff you'd pick up because you want to read it. It's free of jargon, but not free of deep ideas. And he manages to walk those lines. The other thing is that he's a historian by nature. This is a man whose degrees are in history. This is something that's very important in public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is a world where you generally can't do controlled experiments. Yes, you can do some of them in cognition biases, and that all becomes part of public diplomacy. But by and large, you have to look at what was done. And here's a man who knows and writes about the things that were done in what we call public diplomacy over the centuries, and certainly over the last century. So many of these things of which he's so well versed and about which he writes are things that don't have wide currency in the minds of people who think they know history. They're quite obscure, but he knows them, he's deeply read, and what he writes needs to be deeply read. So here it is, Reputational Security and all those. It doesn't come with these blue things. I did those. But I'll ask him to tell us what this is all about. Nick?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I always get so much out of conversations with you, and from engaging around the things that you and I both see as wrong in the world. And I think that it's really terrific that you're available to come and be the chair today. I want to thank both CPD and CCLP, the Center for Communication, Leadership and Policy, for putting that together. And it's wonderful for me to be here with Jeff Cowan, who is the dean who is the former dean of Annenberg, whose vision the Center on Public Diplomacy was, and whose idea it was, how long ago? 20 years ago, when he took a taxi ride across London and invited me to ride along so that we could have a meeting about moving to California. Because various retired diplomats had said, Nick's the person you want to talk to about this master's degree you're planning, and
best person in the world.
So it was a lot of fun being recruited, coming here. So I'm going to say my life. This is the story of how my life got turned upside down, or what have you. So I think that formulation has been taken. So thank you for hosting this event. And thanks for coming, thanks for tuning in. What I want to do with this session is to give you an idea where the new book came from, what it's about, and then to get into questions as soon as possible, because when we announced online that there was going to be a discussion about reputational security, usually you get 1 or 2 questions coming in, and we've had 13 have come in, maybe more since. So I'm going to try and truncate the front end of the talk to make plenty of room for questions. So where does this book come from? This book comes from my experience in the field, going around and looking at how public diplomacy is practiced, and talking to people who are trying to manage the reputation of their countries in an increasingly disrupted environment. So it's the sequel to a book that came out in 2018, which was just an essential foundational introduction to public diplomacy. But as you know, with publishing, there's a lag. So the 2019 book was really done by 2018, 2017. It was all done and dusted. And immediately before that book was sent to the publisher, the world changed dramatically. really as a result of the start of the Ukraine crisis. The British government began becoming very, very worried about what was happening in countries around Russia's border, including Ukraine, and commissioned some investigations. So I found that I was invited to travel to investigate what effective public diplomacy looked like in the Baltic, and then eventually in the Balkans, Western Balkans. And then on my own initiative, I traveled to Kazakhstan. And on these trips, I was talking to government officials, as high as, I think the most senior person I spoke to was sort of a deputy foreign minister. But what I was getting was something that was different from public diplomacy theory. And that made me very interested. Public diplomacy, as we practice it, as we think about it, or as the current most successful nation states practice it, is very much based on the idea of soft power. But the way in which they imagine soft power, that is explaining to the world your values and culture so that they're attracted to you, is based on an idea that, you know, public diplomacy is seen as an optional extra. For the country that has everything, why not add a little soft power just to get a few more tourists, a little more leverage in the United Nations? It's all about more, getting a little more. And when I was talking to, especially I had this conversation in 2017 with the head of the Diplomatic Academy of Kazakhstan, and he really didn't recognize the idea of soft power for getting more. And he told me why he was trying to improve the reputation of Kazakhstan. And it was not so they could get more, it was just so they could continue to exist. He felt that the lesson of Ukraine in 2014 was that if you were not known in the world, really awful things could happen. So right back at him, I said, so you're talking about not soft power, but an idea of a reputational security. And I then continued to run with this idea, to try it out on different government officials who I'd meet. And I found that they latched onto it and they'd say, yeah, absolutely. It's not about soft power for us. It's not about getting more from somebody or getting them to do something for us. It's just about continuing to exist. I was really moved in Kosovo, talking to the deputy foreign minister, when I said, well, can you describe how Kosovo's reputational security has been advanced? And he said, well, when a citizen won a judo medal at the Olympics, that was a major diplomatic success for Kosovo, because when a country wins a medal at the Olympics, that's an achievement of a country. It's not the achievement of a breakaway state from Serbia. It really starts to establish a place in the global imagination. And so I went with this idea, and I began thinking that if an idea is to be true, it has to be true not just right now, but in every time and in every place. So my argument was that if reputation is a dimension of security, then we should be able to find examples of that going right the way back through history and find examples of it everywhere in the world. And I have indeed been able to find really interesting examples of it everywhere in the world at every time in history, and they're set out in the beginning, or a taster of that discussion is set out in the book. I've continued to investigate this, and maybe some of the other more unusual examples will emerge during Q&A. So putting the book together, I start out by giving a frame for reputational security, how I think it works. And the key is that reputational security is not just about accentuating the positive, it's also about adjusting your policies. So not just having a good image, but working to be a good reality. And it's that changing reality element, being better, that has always been part of my argument around public diplomacy, but it's been missing from the wider literature. There is very little in the mainstream soft power literature that's about actually being a better country to increase your soft power. So I'm saying that absolutely you have to include within any discussion of soft power, has to include within it domestic reform. And there are a number of really, I think, quite powerful examples from American history where the United States has realized that it was facing a propaganda challenge and has changed the reality rather than just increasing positive messaging. Best example is Kennedy and Eisenhower's response to Soviet propaganda around American racism. They didn't only accentuate the positive with jazz musicians touring, they worked to make America less racist. And if you look at why Eisenhower and why Kennedy cared about the civil rights movement, unfortunately, part of it is to do with reducing America's exposure during the Cold War. And being better for Cold War reasons, it moved civil rights up the policy agenda. So the chapters in the book, I introduce the concept. I talk about problems around new media and how media is being disrupted today and why our reputations are increasingly being challenged by adversaries. I talk about counter propaganda and how that has worked historically. How, in order to protect your reputation, countries have historically sought to contest hostile and negative messaging. I look at media development as a tool of reputational security. So in order to help your country defend its reputation, help media to be more operate more along democratic lines. I introduce, there's a chapter dealing with information disarmament, and to me this is a logical consequence of weaponized media. One of the great things we see in the world today is that media has become weaponized. My argument is that if media, when we face a weapon, one of the responses we should investigate is a disarmament process around that weapon. And what surprised me was I found that during the 1980s, there was a disarmament process around media that actually was quite successful in taking the tension out of the US relationship with the Soviet Union. But we've amazingly forgotten that process, and I've had to really rediscover the history of the US-Soviet information disarmament process. It's a sidebar to that, is that I had tremendous encouragement writing that chapter from colleagues at the University of St. Petersburg, who then published that chapter in their house journal. They thought it was a really interesting thing that they wanted to know about, not just for American readers. I talk about diaspora and the way in which identities and reputations are operating transnationally now. I talk about the role of culture and how some countries are developing an international cultural profile as part of their security. And I look particularly in that chapter at Taiwan and some Taiwanese cultural projects And then my final chapter is on the United States and what the United States is doing right and what the United States is doing wrong. The final conclusion is a case study of Ukraine, which I think clinches the concept of reputational security, because part of the reason I thought of the idea in the first place was because there was clearly something missing for Ukraine in 2014 that meant it could be invaded, and nobody in the West was as worried as they should have been. And I then look at Ukraine in 2021, 2022, when something had changed. Ukraine experienced a second invasion, or a more, what do you say, a more, a total invasion, and the response of the world had, especially the Western world, was very different. Suddenly Ukraine mattered in a way in which it hadn't in 2014, and part of what had changed was a different level of knowledge about Ukraine. Ukrainian narratives were in the imagination of Western Europe. People knew Ukrainian culture. Even people now attributed, they would say, oh, that a particular Christmas carol was now recognized as, oh, did you know that was a Ukrainian folk tune? It had become, we had all these links to Ukraine that weren't recognized in 2014, and I think we had a very different response to Ukraine in 2022. There's obviously much more in the book, but hopefully that's enough there to give you a sense of where it came from, and there are a few hooks that we can work with for a discussion. So over to you, Barry.
Sure. Well, let me just get you started, and then I'll open to the floor, plus these questions we've already obtained from far and wide. So you're not pushing aside Joseph Nye's at least original formulation of soft
Sure.
power.
Absolutely not.
But just saying it's simply a part of it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and how about, and the sharp power idea that you add coercive economic power, but how about the concept of deterrence? Is that part of your reputational security idea, or is it just a matter of notice, we're really here and we're really alive?
Well, I think that actually, so I say in the introduction that this is not patricide. I'm not saying that Nye was wrong. What I'm saying is that Nye has not been fully understood by the people who practice soft power. So I absolutely, the idea of the negative is present in what Nye has written, and especially at the moment he's talking about the US ceasing to be as attractive as it once was. I think that should be front and center, and we really need to talk seriously about not just a country being attractive, but a country being repulsive. Mm-hmm. And to think, why are people pushed away by some aspects of a country's behavior, some elements of its culture? So deterrence is linked to reputation, and in fact in international relations theory the main reason that international relations theorists were interested in reputation was not is somebody attracted or repelled, but what does somebody think a particular state will do. So when if a state had a reputation for action, it might mean that others were more deterred from pushing against it. So I want a more sophisticated idea of reputation than that which you find in the literature of deterrence. But that was one of my starting points. Was the literature of deterrence.
Maybe it's better to be feared than loved. So how about some questions from the group here? Yes.
Paul.
Yeah. Can you amplify some of the positives of
Hang on just a second.
Yeah.
Can you amplify some of the positive things that the United States should be doing, and conversely, some of the things that they're doing wrong?
Okay, number one thing the United States should do is nominate somebody to be in charge of public diplomacy. To me, it is an era of treasonable dimensions that whichever party is in power 40% of the time, there is no Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs.
That's right.
It is not the top of anybody's bill, and maybe this is the first to-do list. It's not the top of anybody's to-do list. This is because of the end of the United States Information Agency, which was an independent agency. So an agency wouldn't go without a director, but an element of the State Department can go without a nominee for 40% of the time, and nobody thinks it's a big loss. So the number one thing the US should, any administration should do, is appoint somebody to care about public diplomacy. And imagine if the Navy was treated that way. If there was never an admiral of the fleet, it would be insane. What I like in current American public diplomacy is that the United States is helping other countries to develop better public diplomacy. So, for example, a couple of months ago, I was in Slovenia at a conference of digital diplomats, helping those digital diplomats reflect on their practice and be better at communicating not about the United States, but about Moldova and about Poland and for reformers from Belarus, to help them do a better job of communicating. Because the interest in the United States is that those people are better understood around the world. And this is one of the, where I split from soft power theory, is that soft power tends to be seen as a beauty contest of all against all. And I think that right now, where we have so much in common, systemically as democracies, we should be helping other democracies to be as well regarded as they can be, and to have as few negative elements as they can have. So we should be assisting each other, not pushing one forward against the other. To jump over to the world of cultural diplomacy, it used to be assumed, for most of the history of cultural diplomacy, that if somebody overseas is learning Italian, that's a massive defeat for the French. I don't think we should think of it that way. We should think it's great that a European language is being studied. That's going to permit a lifetime of engagement with European culture, and this is maybe something that's been missed among in the reality of how cultural diplomacy is lived by Europeans, is that they help each other, and you might find somebody from one country promoting the arts and cultural life of another, or the educational system of another. Even Britain, as a sadly no longer a member of the European Union, is still affiliated with joint European cultural activities. So we have to have a model for cultural diplomacy that goes beyond just, oh, I want my soft power in the world, I want everyone to see how fantastic I am. We also need people to see how fantastic our neighbors are, and the vulnerable countries at the edge of our region are. That's a long way around. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Let me ask you a question from that were sent in from people who are online. You'll know in hearing this that I could not have invented it. It's way above my pay scale. How to distinguish between ontological and reputational security?
Right. Okay, well, I think the discussion around ontological security is probably something I need to explain. It's an interesting question. Ontological security is a theory that a country's security or sense of security is based on how do you feel about your own identity. Do you feel secure in yourself? So it's an inward-looking concept of security. Reputational security is an outward-looking security. So what do other people think about your reputation? And the strange thing about how these two come together is that sometimes countries do things to feel good about themselves, which make them look terrible to other countries. A good example would be, let's imagine a country that has a special relationship with firearms, who feels that it's important as part of their national identity to have access to firearms, right? So if you can imagine such a country, that they would write into their constitution a right to bear arms. Now that hurts their reputation internationally and it endangers their reputational security, but it's an essential part of their ontological security. And so sometimes I see reputational security and ontological security as being in conflict, and it actually, this conflict actually explains some of the most inexplicable messes in reputational security. So if you want to know why did the Danes think it was a good idea to jeopardize their international reputation by publishing cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, and the answer to that is because it's an important part of ontological security in Denmark to be have a free press and have free media and to let people say outrageous things. You know, when I was a kid, somebody had the idea in Denmark of giving a filmmaker a budget for a film and saying, make any film. This is the government gave him, make any film. So he said, great, thanks. I want to make a film about Jesus using the genre of pornography. Unbelievable, but you know, the Danish government said, well, he has the right to do that. He's an artist. You know, the Vatican felt very differently. This was in 1972, I think, that this scandal. So this wasn't the first time that Denmark had, for reasons of how it felt about itself, offended the rest of the world. You could say the same thing about, this comes up with Japan, and is one of the explanations for the Japanese failure to engage adequately around the comfort women issue. The reason Turkey doesn't want to talk about what happened to the Armenians in 1915. So this is a regular feature of, so I would say that's the long answer. Short answer is reputation is external, ontology is internal. But maybe it's a whole other book to look at how they have hurt each other.
Mm-hmm. Question? Yes?
Thank you. I have a question about examples when reputational security has actually outperformed the actual, power, I guess, of a country. Because I'm trying to figure out whether this is about the effort that people put into public diplomacy, or if this is about it comes across as good reputational security when you've actually got your shit together.
Yes. So the question is then an example of a country
That outperformed.
where the reputation is yes, a country that has more reputation than it deserves.
Bhutan.
Well, that's a that's a good question, because it's hard to say a place has too much reputation. I think right now Canada has more of a positive reputation than it deserves, and because according to Simon Anholt's index, Canada is now the second most admired country in the world, or maybe third after Germany. So it goes Japan, Germany, Canada. And people have amazingly good ideas about Canada. And I think that part of Canada's reputation is that it's North American without being the United States. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like admired for not being the United States, but for still having drive-thrus. And if people knew anything about Canadian politics or Canadian education, they'd be really worried about what's happening to Canada. But it doesn't get the news coverage. So what people know and remember about Canada is way more positive than the reality.
But is that because of efforts in public diplomacy?
No. I think it's to do with how maybe it's to do with historical Canadian behavior. So people think of Canada as being the what do you call it? The international organization country, the peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping force country, and just being like America but not America, less violent, more more open, more famous female writers. So it's as if Canada can somehow be helped by not being the United States. And I've pulled together an anthology on Canadian public diplomacy because I think it's a really interesting subject. But it doesn't. The Canadian public diplomacy does not account for the reputation of Canada.
Jeff?
Nick, do you, in dealing with reputational security, do you think about those people who try to undermine reputational security? For example, you mentioned democracy as being one of the strong elements of our reputation, but the Russians, as we know, and others too perhaps, are trying to undermine the notion of democracy in this country. And one, how do you think of that in terms of our own situation? And number two, should it be part of some parallel group or part of an operation having to do with your new public diplomacy operation in the United States, in which you would deal with the reputation of other countries?
Absolutely, I think that was one of the motivations for writing the book, was to explain that reputation isn't just about saying good things about yourself. Think about how the pandemic worked, where countries would say good things about themselves and bad things about their neighbors. They might even try and give the virus a name that diminished another country. So the attempt, most obvious thing was when President Trump said he wanted to call it the China virus, or he went through a number of different, there was an attempt of each to blame the other for the virus, for the virus. So we could see that there was a sort of, it's like a reputational economy, where to gain benefit to yourself, you try and take away from the reputation of someone else. Nation branding and regional branding is part of this. The Nordics have had the strongest international reputation of a region for a while. The image of the Nordic countries is under attack from Russian media, Kremlin-based media, which is trying to associate the Nordic countries with sexual abuse. And this is a standard way of talking about Nordic countries in Kremlin-sponsored media. Some of the stories are so colorful that if I told them to you, they would then dominate. That would be the only takeaway you'd have from this talk, would be, wow, that was the time when Professor Cull said that the Russians are alleging that Danes do X, Y, and Z.
And it's hard to know which way it would cut for the Danes.
Yes, that's right. I don't want to go there because the Russian lies are more interesting than my book. But hearing from Danish diplomats that they had to find a way of pushing back against destabilization. Hearing from the Swedish, the Swedes have a psychological security office, or not quite a ministry, but it's part of the Department of Defense that is supposed to keep Sweden secure in terms of communication. In terms of these ideas, and they feel that their election is being subverted, that lies are being told, that the society is being disrupted.
And so what do they do? What do they actually do to counteract it?
Well, that's a good question. I think that investing in media literacy is part of what you need to do to get people to think before they share. As a historian, I can say this isn't the first time this has come up. In fact, Jeff, your dad was part of the effort during World War II to break up some of the myths that were being told about the United States within the United States during World War II. Particularly, just to back up here, when the US entered World War II, the government became convinced that disinformation would be used to disrupt the American war effort, that the Germans would insert viral stories into the American media and popular culture that would make people want to fear Germany or stay away from munitions plants and things like that. So the US government established a survey process for monitoring public opinion across the country, recruiting people like policemen, barbers, beauticians, and school teachers to feedback what they were hearing, rumors they were hearing from customers, pupils. And what they found is that American rumors weren't coming from outside, but that America is completely capable of subverting itself. And all of the rumors were about America, pretty much all of America's rumors were about race. The number one American rumor was that black people were somehow going to take the opportunity of the war effort to claim a different place in society, that there was going to be some kind of civil rights movement, and that Jewish people were exempt from national service, that didn't have to be conscripted. So the US government realized that if it broadcast these rumors and said it is not true that Jews don't have to serve in the US military, people would hear the rumor and would not hear the countering of it. So what they decided to do was to integrate into American popular culture a vision of America as being an integrated country, one nation fighting together, and make sure that people who are writing stories had Americans of every kind in every story. So if you're going to have a film about an American bomber, you had to have O'Hara and Kowalski and Bernstein, all together. And your dad made sure there was an African-American character in a major soap opera, right? Yeah. So and this was all part of an American government initiative to sell the positive. But part of this is reacting to an awareness of really listening to find out what the negative is, and then giving somebody something positive that they can look to. And the best defense against attacks on democracy is to really be an inspiring democracy and to show that you can cope with problems that come up. The response to Russian claims that democracies are corrupt, and this is my feedback to the British government, is that, or the Foreign Office, is not that they should ignore the things that Russia is saying about Britain being a corrupt country, but they should try and actually be less corrupt and less welcoming of oligarch money. How about being less welcoming of oligarch money in London, rather than just telling Ukraine to control its oligarchs? Sorry, Mary.
Okay.
Nick, I'm not sure if
Sorry,
this is.
Barry,
I'm not sure if this is a superficial question or not, but I want to know what you think about this. Because you talked about culture, you talked about communication. How does the ability of the leader of the country to communicate impact their reputational security?
Right.
Good question.
That's a good question. I think that obviously leaders are important, but it's perfectly possible for a country to have multiple reputations about many things. Mm-hmm. And so what we know from looking at poll data on the United States during the well, not to dance around the issue, but during the Trump administration, how bad did it get? Mm-hmm. The United States, I would say, eased back in global polling during the Trump administration. It went from being number 2, because Obama, towards the end, hadn't been great. People were put off by the Snowden revelations. So the US went from being number 2 to being number 7. Right? The world was particularly concerned about American democracy. It felt that Americans didn't like each other, and the American political model was no longer the most admired political model in the world. and the world was concerned about American people. It felt that American people didn't like each other, and that if American people don't like each other, why would they like a foreigner coming into the United States? So those two figures, which had been very strong for the US, went from being number 1 or number 2 in those indicators to being like a 10th most admired political system, 18th most admired people. But nobody was saying, oh, let's make Putin the number 1, right? So nobody admired Putin's Russia as a substitute for the United States. Nobody said, well, Xi's China should be the substitute for the United States. Even within Europe, you could see that the chair at the head of the table for thinking about security was left vacant during the Trump years. It wasn't like Macron could just sit there and take over, or Merkel, as it was then, could take over. Rather, they had. It was as if they nodded to the empty seat, and was still sort of feeling that the United States needed to be there. So a country's reputation is based on more than just leadership. Leadership is important, but in the US you also have important engagement around exports, important engagement around people's desire to live in the country, around ideas of American history, and of course American popular culture. So these are all, there are many other categories too. But leadership is only one, and might actually be overvalued as a category.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing we know is that most countries are unaware of the political party of whoever's leading at a time. Political parties are, in most places, are at home. So very few people could tell you the political party of Mexico's new president. They could tell you that she's a woman, but they couldn't tell you which political party she was from.
If I can offer one other thing to amplify what you were saying. The Pew study, the international study that began around 1999, does an annual, just general attitude question saying positive or negative on a list of countries, and on the US by a list of countries, which list changes. And interestingly, the drop when we went from Obama to Trump was very stark. But Trump didn't go any lower than George W.
No.
It was comparable. And then when Biden came in, it went right back up to where it had been with Obama. And then it drifts and changes after that. So you do get the impression, basically, that in this country there is a real awareness by the world of what party they're from. And basically that if the election were held there, they'd all vote Democratic. So that the unique personality of Trump didn't seem to mean that he got lower than George W., which is interesting.
What about Zelensky's?
They didn't ask that. Yeah, but he really, that man is a master of public diplomacy. Yeah.
Well, this is an interesting, this brings us to the conclusion of the book, which is a sustained treatment of the Ukrainian case. Ukraine is the only country that has a foreign minister who is a public diplomacy expert, who ran a public diplomacy agency. And Dmitry Kuleba has actually said, for Ukraine, reputation is a matter of security. So he's actually said it, put it in a tweet. I was on the call when he was doing an introduction to a conference. This is a real thing. It has been part of Ukraine's strategy. In 2021, as the Russian invasion became closer and closer, we could see all kinds of maneuvering in Ukraine to try and protect their reputation. But it wasn't just getting their story out in a positive way. That autumn of 2021, the big show on Netflix was Emily in Paris. Mm-hmm. And if you remember, Emily made friends with a Ukrainian girl who turned out to be a kleptomaniac and would go shoplifting in Galerie Lafayette and all those beautiful and the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry launched a high-profile complaint against Netflix over Emily in Paris. All the things they could have been doing, were they wasting their time? I don't think so. I think actually that drawing attention to the fact that Ukraine is a country that cares about itself and that does not deserve to be treated as like a joke place was important. Similarly, with Borat,
Right.
you know, I actually got to ask Kazakhstani diplomats, what do you think about Borat? And the answer I got was from the ones who are most engaged with issues of opinion was, Borat has been a gift to Kazakhstan.
Right.
Because people know one thing about Kazakhstan, and even though it's a joke thing, it's one thing, and they don't know anything about Tajikistan or
Azerbaijan,
Kyrgyzstan
yeah.
or any of those other countries in that region, Uzbekistan, but they know one thing about Kazakhstan, and that's that they've had a laugh about Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan has begun introducing Borat's catchphrases into their promotional material. So right now the tourist poster for Kazakhstan says, Kazakhstan, nice! But they also thought they'd go with Kazakhstan, winter is coming, and that was as they were borrowing from Game of Thrones too. But Kazakhstan, nice. And yeah, so I thought, well, that's really interesting, where just being a joke is better and is a start.
All ink is good ink. Anyway, Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, I did.
Thank you, Nick. I was especially intrigued by the Taiwan example. Since Taiwan has focused on issues like its contribution to medical care during COVID, its desire to participate in global health conferences, obviously its ability to produce silicon chips that are of unique value, its university communities, et cetera. But despite all those efforts, and I think concerted efforts at establishing reputational security, if your adversary doesn't care about its reputation and is willing to use hard power to achieve what objectives they want to pursue, then reputational security may not even come close to saving you. And so the issue may be, how do we establish a shared set of global values around what nations need to do to gain the respect and autonomy to simply exist? And you know, I think similarly with Ukraine, I mean, the issue is Russia didn't care at all about how the rest of the world judged their participation in this war. And their allies, North Korea and Iran, are all already pariahs in terms of reputation. So how do you address that kind of imbalance?
I think part of the, when I was trying to conceptualize reputational security, I imagined it as a threshold. The threshold at which you get help from the international community. So some countries have, or Ukraine in 2014 fell short of the threshold. By 2022, it was past the threshold. If you can, so whether you get to the threshold or not is still not about surviving. Sometimes countries get aid, they reach the threshold, but they still fail. And it doesn't mean they're not trying. And of course, hard power is still important, but why sacrifice a advantage that you could get? So I looked at compared the case of Czechoslovakia and Poland in the run-up to World War II. Poland received a guarantee from Britain and France. Czechoslovakia did not. If you look at why Czechoslovakia did not get a guarantee, Prime Minister Chamberlain himself says that it's impossible to contemplate war over a far country and people of whom we know nothing. So he was saying we don't know who the Czechs are. But Britain and France did know who the Poles were, partly because of Polish music. I was able to find many, many more examples, twice as many examples of Poland being mentioned during the life of the restored state as of Czechoslovakia, 4 times as many in the Manchester Guardian mentions of Poland as Czechoslovakia during the period 1918 to 1938. So being known helps, but it still doesn't mean that Poland had a great time between 1939 and 1945. You know, it meant it had some things going for it, but it isn't a miracle. Taiwan is a really interesting situation right now because they are trying very hard and quite selectively to show that they're different. And it's been very interesting to see how they have invested in LGBT communications, talking about Taiwan as the first Asian country to allow, or the first Asian polity to allow same-sex marriage. The case in the book is about an exhibit that Taiwan did in Venice. They always exhibit in the prison cell where Casanova was held captive. They decided to do an exhibit based around that link to Casanova by doing a whole exhibit that was about sexual freedom and absence of censorship and surveillance. So with the point of view of saying Taiwan is not like another place we could mention that has a lot of surveillance and a lot of repression of human expression. They asked a Parisian-based Taiwanese film director to create an video installation for Venice. She did it in the medium of pornography or a pornographic, an aesthetic that was drawn from pornography, and it was an amazing show, very, very moving, but it was essentially a love letter to the Marquis de Sade. So if you're going to this exhibit, you're being completely confronted with the most extreme images imaginable, but a country is saying to you, we think you need to hear this. A nation state is saying, we're going to tell a story about the Marquis de Sade. We're going to tell a story about Michel Foucault based on his sexuality. We're going to talk about not the cases where you say, oh, that's fine, it's in private, it's between consenting adults, but where you feel super uncomfortable. So Taiwan created this amazing art exhibition. It's very, very challenging. And they have been able to show it in Hong Kong. They haven't been able to show it in Taiwan. So this is a super interesting thing to study. And I rest my case, my lord, as they say in there.
Now, we're supposed to turn into pumpkins at 1:30, right? Is that right?
We have until 1:30.
Well, until 1:30. Well, we got 1 minute left, so I'll take from the screen here one question that should have a very quick answer. Please give some examples of the best practices in U.S. public diplomacy in these worrisome times.
Well, for me, the best practice is empowering others. 20 years ago, when we were setting up public diplomacy at USC, public diplomacy was about what can you say to be persuasive to your audience. Now public diplomacy is about who can you empower to be persuasive to your audience. And I think that the best things that America now is doing, or the United States is now doing, is empowering others to be persuasive to their own and to their neighbors, not the United States talking for trying to find the great thing that an American can say that can solve an international communications issue.
Okay, thank you. That answers now. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the best Christmas gift you could possibly get. And if you think it's not good enough, buy 3 of them for your friends.
It's around $20 too, so it's not. I didn't want to do one of those $100 things that.
And we're sorry we didn't have the copies of the book here in the room, but you can go to the bookstore, get it there, you can order it.
Amazon.
So please do, you can get it at Amazon. And I just want to ask, Jeff, if you have any last words as a co-sponsor of this
For
event.
another topic, for another time, I'd like to ask Nick if you would discuss whether an element of reputational security should ever be that this country should undermine the reputation of any of our adversaries.
Ooh, on that bombshell. My feeling is that that right now there's a lot of inauthentic communication in the world, and that the United States should not be setting up sock puppets on social media, pushing out untrue things, and certainly that shouldn't be done through American embassies, because you will always be found out. To get away with disinformation, you have to be incredibly lucky or a genius. And right now, the United States does not have a lucky face. So I think that we are better off being always about fair, honest communication, hearing both sides, and we should not be using inauthentic communication.
Just to say, in fairness, I wasn't saying inauthentically
Disinformation,
attacking
no.
reputation. I was saying, should we ever be concerned about accurately
Right.
undermining the reputation of
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We should be empowering people who wish to criticize their countries where they've got something to say. I think that's part of it, but not making it up. There's, there's real stuff going wrong in Iran without making anything
Right.
up.
Most of what's done in the world that we call disinformation is actually malinformation. True things that are embarrassing and that are pushed out, and there's plenty of that out there to do it with. With that, thank you.
Barry.
Thank you.